Some first home buyers are getting up to $100,000 in first home buyers grants, savings and incentives. If you're looking to buy or build your first home, I'm going to break down how you can get up to $100,000 in all these incentives and also go over some awesome tips I've learned from buying and building my first home and some mistakes I've made. But just a quick heads up, I'm not saying now is the best time to buy or right time to buy. We're in very uncertain times, but you can use these tips so when you are ready to buy or you do think it's a good time to buy, you have all the tools ready to take advantage of these offers. Okay, let's start off with New South Wales, the most expensive region, but most of these rules and tips apply to everywhere in the country, and then I'll also get into the other states. So the first incentive, if you're buying or building your first home, is you'll qualify for the $10,000 first home buyer grant. This grant applies to those buying or building your new home, and the value of the existing house has to be below $600,000. And if you're building a house, the house and land package has to be below $750,000 to be eligible for this $10,000 first home buyer grant. A new scheme that's been announced is the Home Builder Scheme, and that is where you get $25,000 for building your new home between the 4th of June to the 31st of December this year, 2020. And the value of the home has to be below $750,000, and this gives us a total so far of $35,000 in first home buyers grants, but there's still many more. The New South Wales government recently announced they're increasing the threshold for stamp duty exemptions or concessions from the 1st of August to the 31st of July, meaning that home buyers can now save a huge amount on stamp duties. So let's look who are eligible. To be eligible, you must be buying an existing home, building a new home, or buying vacant land which you intend to build. The properties that qualify for this full stamp duty exemption, meaning you don't pay stamp duty at all, are brand new homes worth less than $800,000 or existing homes worth $650,000 or less, or buying land which you intend to build on worth $400,000 or less, meaning if you buy any of these properties, you won't have to pay stamp duty at all. But if you've got a bit more of expensive taste, you can still get a concession for buying a brand new home between $800,000 and $1 million, buying an existing home between $650,000 and $800,000, or buying vacant land which you intend to build worth $400,000 to $500,000, meaning you'll get a discount on the stamp duty you pay if you're buying a bit more expensive properties in these price ranges. So that gives you a savings. For example, if you're buying land worth $400,000 and you intend to build on it, of $13,000 in stamp duty savings. Stamp duty is a tax that first home buyers have to pay when they buy their first home. It's really expensive and I think it's a rip-off. So that brings our total first home buyer savings and incentives so far to $48,000. Recently, the government announced a new scheme where first home buyers can pay just a 5% deposit to secure their first home. Now, previously, most banks wouldn't want to lend to first home buyers with only a 5% deposit. And if you did use a 5% deposit, you would have to pay huge amounts in something called lender's mortgage insurance. So let's have a look on how much first home buyers are now saving by not having to pay this lender's mortgage insurance payment. If you were to buy or build your first home and say, for example, it was $700,000 and you take up this 5% first home buyer's deposit scheme, you'll actually save a huge amount of between $30,000 to $32,000 in lender's mortgage insurance, depending on the lender, bringing our total first home buyer savings and incentives so far to $80,000. Now, I'm not saying go buy a property with a 5% deposit in Sydney or Melbourne. That's very risky right now. There's no need to FOMO in right now. It's probably a better idea to save more money, increase your deposit, and you may even get a discount by waiting if property prices fall further. Did you know there are a lot of hungry builders and developers out there that are actually willing to pay 5% for your build deposit? Normally when you build a home, you have to show the bank that you've paid a 5% deposit for the construction costs. But some builders are willing to pay this and they give that receipt to the bank so you don't have to pay this. So for example, if you're going to build your home and it's worth $300,000, you're saving $15,000 by not having to pay this deposit, and that is something my builder paid. And this can also save you a lot of money in the long run if you're in a booming market where, for example, where I am building in Ballarat, if I waited to save an extra $15,000 to pay that build deposit, I would have had to pay $40,000 more for the block of land because the prices were booming. But if your prices aren't booming, there's no need to rush. But it is another incentive that builders are willing to pay, and that brings our total first home buyers, buildings and incentives and grants to $95,000. And in some circumstances, you could even get $100,000 in first home buyer grants, savings and incentives. So you got the $10,000 first home buyers grant, you got $25,000 home builder grant, you saved around $13,000 in stamp duty, you saved around $30,000 to $32,000 in lender's mortgage insurance, and you saved about $15,000 by not having to pay the build deposit. This means in some areas in Sydney, if you buy land where it's worth under $400,000, you could get started on your journey to purchasing or building your first home with as little as $20,000. But again, I'm not saying that's a good idea. You definitely want to save a bigger deposit right now because you don't want to fall into something called negative equity, where that means your mortgage is actually more than your home is worth. Now let's have a look at Victoria. In Victoria, if you build in the metropolitan region, you'll get $10,000 for your first home buyer's grant. But if you build in regional, and a lot of people are wanting to move to regional right now and get out of Melbourne because things are crazy right now and they want more space and the land values are cheaper, you can actually get $20,000 for your first home buyer's grant. And again, you'll get the 25K home builder grant. So let's have a look at what properties qualify for these grants. So to qualify for these two grants, the house and land package that you intend to build on has to be below $750,000 in the metropolitan area and below $600,000 in the regional areas. Now, to apply for the full stamp duty exemption, your property has to be worth below $600,000 in order to pay no stamp duty, or you can get a discount where the property is worth between $600,000 and $750,000. That means if you're building your first home and the property is worth, say for example, $600,000, the house and land package, and the land which you only pay stamp duty on, you don't pay stamp duty on the build, is worth $300,000, you'll actually save $11,000 by not having to pay stamp duty. So that brings our first home buyer savings and incentives so far to $56,000. But just like New South Wales and every other state in Australia, you won't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance if you just use a 5% deposit as a first home buyer. And if you're building, a house and land package worth $600,000, you'll actually save $28,000 in lending mortgage insurance, depending on the lender. And that brings our total first home buyers grants, savings and incentives to $80,000. And again, if you can find a builder or developer to pay your build deposit, you will save $15,000 by not having to pay that, by making the builder pay that. And then that brings our total first home buyer savings and incentives in Victoria, just like New South Wales, to around $95,000, maybe in $100,000 in some circumstances. So this really is helping out first home buyers a lot, but some say it makes everything more expensive and unaffordable, so it's not really helping out that much. So in Victoria, if you're buying land in order to build and use up all these incentives, you could get started with just $15,000. Again, I'm not recommending you do this, especially in Victoria. Things are very uncertain, prices are declining, but if you do find a market and you do think prices are going to boom, or you do think now's the right time to buy, you can potentially do this, but it would be best to save a bigger deposit in these uncertain times. You can apply all these things to any other state in the country, and in specifically Western Australia, I've heard that the new home market is booming. So I'm sure in any other state you could get between $70,000 to $100,000 if you're smart and take up all these incentives, or find other builders or developers that are hungry for business. Now don't go anywhere. I'm about to give you some very, very important tips for first home buyers and mistakes I learned from buying and building my first home. So let's have a look on these first home buyer tips and how you can avoid the mistakes I made. Now just a warning, just because you're getting all these incentives doesn't mean the house and land package you're going to buy is worth it. Sure, you could get all these incentives, but if the house and land package is $100,000 overvalued and the property market drops 20%, and if you're buying a property or building a property worth $600,000, that you're going to lose $120K in equity, meaning you actually lose money, not make money. So it doesn't mean it's worth it just because you're getting all these incentives. My second tip, when you're buying or building your first home or going through a developer, builder or consultant, make sure you get everything in writing. There are a lot of dodgy agents, consultants out there, so you can't take their word for it. And a mistake I made was the consultant told me they were going to cover the conveyancing and legal fees, just for me to later find out when the land title, the consultant said, no, I never said that. No, you got to pay that. And because I didn't have it in writing, I had to pay $1,100 in legal fees, which definitely wasn't nice. There are also a huge amount of fees that you may not be aware of that could get added onto your loan, or you may have to pay up front. And I can't memorize them all, so I've written them down here. So things like settlement fees, loan application fees, annual fees, valuation fees, title fees, legal fees, the bank charging fees for settlement, and many more. So you want to factor in at least $2,000 to $3,000 to cover all these fees, just in case you have to pay them up front, or you don't want them added onto a loan, which are going to accrue interest. Something I hugely recommend, and what some people don't do and could cost them tens of thousands of dollars later in the future, is you want to get your own independent builder inspector. You don't just want to trust a developer or builder's inspector, you want to get your own. And this will cost you between $400 to $500 at each stage, but could save you tens of thousands of dollars later. The private builder inspector will come when they lay the slab, when they do the frame, when they do the lockup stage, when they do all the fixtures and fittings, and again at the final handover. And this may cost you $400 to $500 at each stage, but something that the builder inspector picked up for my build was there were some cracks on the tiles. There was just a few other tiles that were a bit out of line. There was a leak in the roof, and the builder fixed up these things straight away. And you don't want something to be missed, especially with today's standards, especially with the apartments, they're finding so much issues. It's worth the money to pay it, so you don't have any problems in the future. Another big mistake, and something that's quite devastating and sad to see, is when you buy a land off the plan or from the developer, just whatever their price is selling for. Say for example, if they're selling you a block of land for $300,000, it doesn't actually mean that land is worth $300,000. And they get a big shock when, for example, the land titles, and the bank will go out there and they'll value the land. The bank could say, no, this land is only worth $260,000, meaning that the customer has to pay that $40,000 in difference or risk losing their deposit. So this is another thing that you have to be aware of. Whatever the developer's charging you doesn't mean it's worth it. So do your research on title blocks in your suburb to see if that's fair value. Another tip, which is pretty obvious, what you should do is shop around. But this is a huge purchase, not like shopping around for your electricity bills where you could save, $100 a year here or there. This is for building your first home. And this could save you, tens of thousands, up to $50,000 by shopping around or negotiating with the builders or developers to get more upgrades included for free. So make sure you do your research, shop around, get other quotes from other builders, developers, and you could save tens of thousands of dollars just by doing this. You want to make sure that your site costs are fixed. The last thing you want to come up is where the builder, gives you a call and says, look, mate, we've got a problem here. We've got this big boulder. It's going to cost you 5 G's to remove it. That's the last thing you want as a first home buyer, where you may not have a bigger deposit, a lot of savings in the bank. So you want to make sure that all these site costs are fixed and there's not going to be any other hidden site costs come up to bite you later on. Another tip, you want to make sure you budget other things like landscaping, getting the blinds, the fly screens put in. There may be other little fixtures and fittings you may need to do, connecting the internet, power. This could add up to $5,000, maybe more depending on the landscaping you want to do. So you need to factor this in when you're building as well. You want to do research on your own suburb, because the property market isn't just one market. There could be headlines saying property prices are booming or crashing, in Melbourne or Sydney, but in your suburb, they may be doing the opposite. Maybe, Melbourne's declining, but, if you're in a Pacific suburb where there's lots of demand, prices could be booming. So you need to do research on your Pacific suburb. An example for me, in 2018 and 2019, when there was a Banking Royal Commission, house prices in Melbourne were falling a lot, but that was mostly on the southeast side of Melbourne and mostly in the upper end of the market. But where I lived in the western suburbs of Melbourne, on the fringe suburbs, house prices were still booming 20 to 30% per year. So that's why it's so example, not just to look at the headlines, but get down to the micro fundamentals of your suburb and make an educated decision on what you think your suburb is going to do. If you're still watching, you're awesome. And if you haven't already, smash the like button for the holy YouTube algorithm. It really helps out the channel a lot. Comment your tips What do you think are some awesome tips for first home buyers? And if you haven't already, subscribe for more awesome content on property market updates, the economy, personal finance and investing. And of course, I'll see you in the next video.